All right, this is going to be a long video, so let's get into it. This week we are dealing again with two broad sets of institutions that are supposed to be above politics or apolitical. Now, what does that mean? That political institutions are part of government but are nevertheless not political. On the part of bureaucracy, which is the subject of Chapter 11, the idea is that the civil servants are in the business of implementation and not the kinds of activities that we commonly consider to be political. In that sense, members of the federal bureaucracy are trained to help convert legislation and executive orders into policy. But because they're not elected, they're supposed to act in a way that sort of doesn't give you an idea of whatever political beliefs they might have. In fact, during the New Deal, Congress became so worried about the prospects of the rapidly growing civil service becoming excessively influential that they passed the Hatch Act in 1939. This law was supposed to enforce upon members of the federal civil service an injunction to avoid overt expressions of political opinions, particularly when they were in the act of doing their job. Now, who do you think that the Hatch Act was particularly aimed at? Having read a bit about the context of the late 1930s, I can tell you that there were two sets of civil servants that legislators were particularly worried about: postal workers and the military. With the latter, I think the concern is clearly justified. The military operates within a chain of command. They have lots of guns. It would, and how hard would it be for a partisan general to call troops under his command and issue an order to cast their ballots for a particular party? In the case of the Postal Service, the challenge is just how large a presence the Postal Service has in all 50 states. If you think about it, there are post offices virtually throughout the United States, in large urban areas, in tiny towns, even out in the countryside. There are over 700,000 people working for the Postal Service. That's a lot of potential voters if they're voting like members of the Postal Service. The Hatch Act is designed to basically set rules in place that make it difficult for civil servants to influence the competitive aspect of politics. In other words, the Hatch Act is a warning to bureaucrats to stay out of electoral politics. It's been liberalized in the 1990s, but there's still the expectation that civil servants are supposed to be apolitical. So, bureaucracy is not supposed to be political, but they often engage in activities that draw them into political battles, particularly in a hyperpartisan environment where the two parties have such diametrically opposed visions of what the government is and should be doing and not doing. Think, for example, of a government corporation. What is a government corporation? This is an enterprise the federal government sets up in order to engage in activities that are desirable, that serve the community and contribute to economic well-being, but that don't have a sufficiently clear profit potential that private businesses are willing to invest capital. Think of a contemporary example. Freddie Mac. What is it that Freddie Mac does? They create secondary markets for mortgages. And what does that mean? It means that Freddie Mac, along with another government corporation called Fannie Mae, buy mortgages from savings and loans banks with the intent of lifting from those obligations the risk they assumed when they extended the loans to people trying to buy homes. Now, why should the government do this sort of thing? Well, simply put, it incentivizes banks to extend more mortgages. In other words, it facilitates the expansion of home ownership. And owning a home is one of the clearest pathways into the middle class. So in one sense, this is clearly desirable activity. More homeowners means more financial security in old age. It means that you've got a valuable thing that you can cash in at need, which should reduce poverty among the elderly. So do political parties view the activities of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae similarly? Not really. Democrats clearly support them, and Republicans clearly want to shut them down. So why do Democrats love Freddie and Fannie, and why do Republicans hate them? Ideology is probably the best explanation. Democrats believe in expanding the middle class and giving low-income Americans an opportunity to own a home is a relatively non-intrusive and low-cost way of expanding those opportunities. Republicans, on the other hand, believe that such programs are in fact intrusive and create a risk of moral hazard in which financial institutions engage in increasingly risky extensions of loans to riskier pools of mortgage seekers. There's a lot to be said for both positions, and I'm not interested in advocating one side or the other. What I do hope you'll think about is the position it puts people who are working at Freddie and Fannie. That one set of politician wants them, wants to support them, and another one wants to basically fire them. So now imagine being a regulator working for the Securities and Exchange Commission, charged with protecting the marketplace from powerful investors who might want to manipulate the market to guarantee even richer returns. As a federal regulator, you make a pretty nice salary, but nothing in comparison to what a white shoe investor you're going to be investigating is making. How easy is it for the investment banking industry to pressure SEC regulators into looking the other way? How much money does the investment banking industry pay to lobbyists to persuade Congress to cut funding of regulatory agencies like the SEC, so that they have to cut staff and do more with fewer regulators? How often are regulators offered cushy jobs to cross over and work within the investment banking community to help them learn how to better evade regulatory scrutiny? Let's move on to Chapter 12. With the judiciary, why are the courts designed to be beyond politics? In a functioning democracy, the law exists to punish people who violate the law. The danger of politics is that political conflicts can spill over from the electoral competition into the application of the law. Think about it today. You've got a president of the United States calling on his opponent to be investigated for crimes that he alleged happened during the election. When the law is functioning effectively, you go to jail for murder, rape, theft, or fraud. You don't go to jail because you oppose somebody in a powerful political position. The danger of the law being taken up and being used as a weapon against opponents is a fundamental threat to rule of law and to democratic governance. So let's talk about some of the issues raised in this chapter. Has anyone ever said to you, don't make a federal case of it? What is the distinction between federal law and state law? How many of you have ever been, prior to the liberalization of the beer laws here, gone to Kansas, Missouri, Texas, bought some beer and brought it across state lines to enjoy at home? Is that a violation of federal law? Think about our discussion of federalism from week 2. Part of the jurisdiction of the federal government is to regulate interstate commerce between and among the states. So that's a federal case. Another example, did you know that it's a crime to transport minors across state lines? If you're a member of a church group and you transport, a few girls from from a church choir from Oklahoma to Arkansas to perform at a Sunday service, you could at least be in theory committing a federal crime. Why is the federal government worried about the transport of minors? Well, it had a lot to do with how the mafia functioned in the early part of the 20th century. A big part of what organized criminal organizations' business model was prostitution. They got young girls in big eastern cities like New York and Philadelphia hooked on drugs and alcohol, drove them from the East Coast to Chicago or Las Vegas or other territories they controlled. If the young women were lucky, they might end up working at a club or even become some kind of movie star. If they were less lucky, they'd end up on the streets, plying their trade. Congress basically passed a law that enabled the FBI to go after the mafia for doing that sort of thing. I should note that this federal law was also frequently used to jail African American men for traveling with white women. Another important issue addressed in this chapter are the different levels of courts in the federal judiciary. Of course, at the lower level, you have the 94 federal district courts, occupied by roughly 687 district court judges. These courts exercise original jurisdiction, which means that if prosecutors determine that a federal law has been violated, that's the starting point. If a defendant loses at the district level, then they go to jail, but they can appeal the ruling to the Circuit Court of Appeals. So what does it take for a defendant to win that sort of appeal? At the top of the federal judiciary is the Supreme Court. What does Article 3 of the Constitution mention about the Supreme Court? What legal power does it vest in the Supreme Court? If you read Article 3, it literally says the judicial power shall be vested in a Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress shall from time to time ordain and establish. What does the Constitution mean with the statement, the judicial power? How large should the court be? What are the qualifications to serve as a justice or a federal judge for that matter? These are important questions about which the Constitution is largely silent. So how do these sorts of issues get decided? Another important and increasingly contentious issue is how federal judges and justices are appointed. The confirmation process is pretty clearly spelled out. The president nominates and the Senate advises and consents. But this is where things and the contentious nature of American politics really, come out. Because of our political parties have fundamentally incommensurate visions of the role of government, and particularly in the realm of regulatory policy, the person that's president has become an issue of first importance. Republican presidents have increasingly nominated federal judges and justices that are critical of the scope of regulatory policy, while Democratic presidents have tended to nominate judges and justices who essentially agree that the federal government has an obligation to regulate. Why has the confirmation process become so controversial? To raise a contemporary example, in February of 2016, Associate Justice Antonin Scalia died suddenly. That same day, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced that he would not allow hearings on Scalia's replacement. He basically said, we will not advise and consent. 20 days later, then President Obama announced his nomination of Merrick Garland, who was a well-respected chief judge of the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, who he had prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombing situation. He managed the trial, managed the prosecution of Ted Kaczynski, who was the Unabomber. He had managed the prosecutions of the Atlanta Olympics bombing. McConnell reiterated that he would not hold any kind of vote. He basically said, we're going to have an election first. So what does the situation tell you about the state of the nomination process for the federal judiciary? Is the nomination and confirmation process outside politics? I would say not. Regardless of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, my view is that McConnell just, intensified the politics surrounding the application of the law. And that really doesn't bode well for our politics. I'm open to other perspectives. I'll close with a brief discussion of judicial philosophy. The text discusses the difference between judicial restraint and judicial activism. Nearly all judges describe themselves as advocates of judicial restraint. That again reflects the norms within the legal community, that judges merely interpret the law and they don't get themselves involved with making law, or what in the judicial community they would call issuing obiter dicta, which is legislating from the bench. The reality is that there's plenty of activism on both sides of the judicial aisle, both liberal and conservative side. When Barack Obama was president, conservative members of the Supreme Court were far more likely to engage in judicial activism, striking down actions that they deemed to be beyond the proper constitutional scope of the executive. Now that Donald Trump is president, progressive judges are far more likely to strike down his more aggressive attempts to restrict immigration from certain parts of the world on the grounds that they're discriminatory in nature. So do you believe in judicial restraint? If you were a federal judge or justice, do you think you would consistently avoid striking down laws even if you believed that they violated the Constitution? Consistency is tough when you think that the other side isn't playing by the rules. That's part of the reason why judicial processes have become so contentious and so political. So, hopefully this very long video will give you plenty of issues to talk about as we discuss these issues over the course of the week. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me. Let's have a great week.